Just
don't let me near those Sharpies.
We took them away.
I know.
As they give them to you. Let's go now.
Let's go on. All right. So open-ended questions and surveys, I really like open-ended questions and surveys, and I think that, if I were to make a blanket recommendation that you should include 2 or so in your surveys, and because they can give you so much information. But it is a lot more work to have open-ended comments than it is to have questionnaires. I mean, just the circles, the numbers. But if you don't have the opportunity for open-ended questions, you may lose a lot of information, a lot of context, a lot of feelings that people have. It really helps people feel more engaged. And the people who don't need it aren't going to use it. And in fact, most people probably aren't going to use it. But if people really care, they will use it. And it's an opportunity, one, for you to explore new ideas that you have not, that you don't know about, or you don't know how to rank things. Like, a lot of times people put in an open-ended question something like, I think we have it in today's, what was the most helpful thing about the presentation? You don't want to have forced choice for that. You really want people to be able to just answer their impressions, be exploratory about it. The other thing is it can give you kind of impressions. It can give people an opportunity to really talk about what was sort of important, or what they liked, or what they didn't like. It can also get you more complex information that might be more difficult to ask in a scale. And a lot of times it can just give you simple elaboration. So let's talk about how to word them, and then we're going to talk about what to do with the information that you have. All right, just based on your general knowledge of your own life, what's wrong with these questions?
First one's too, there's no context.
Well, yes, let's pretend there's a context. Let's pretend let's pretend there's another survey. But what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this question? As you read it, what do you feel?
It's just so big.
It's so big.
I could write a dissertation on the question the size of that.
Well, there's this we could do, and there's that we could do, and maybe we could do this other thing, right? Maybe on a board of directors you could ask this if it was clear what the options were. But maybe this is what Barbara meant by there's no context. Like, what are the options? Like, what are we talking about? Even if you knew you were talking about, like, I don't know, the art program. What direction should we go in next? If you're like, here are the 3 options. But then if there's 3 options, give them the 3 options, right?
You want to say interesting.
You want to say what?
It depends.
It depends, yes, that's what you want, and actually you will get it, people will write it depends. What about this? What did you like or not like about today's presentation? What's wrong with that question?
Just 2 questions.
It's 2 questions. You are either going to get people to say what they like, or people are going to say what they didn't like. Nobody is going to have a like and a dislike that they name. Nobody. If you want to know what they like, ask them what they like. If you want to know what they dislike, ask them what they dislike. What's this one? I love this one. What's wrong with that one?
Question.
Well, it's not a question. That's the
Thinking
least of
about
its
one.
problems.
Reminds me of a math problem.
Yeah, it's like geometry or something, right?
I never answer those.
Why not?
What are you thinking about? Everything about it turns me off. I don't want to go through that level of detail on the general
Right.
survey.
Enough
It's just
said.
too much.
What about these? What about this? That's essentially the question from before, isn't it? It's still a hard question. You're asking a high-level question, but you could answer this, right? It doesn't just say everything we should do. It says, help us narrow down what's most important, and it even gives you like a time frame. Because if you look at that first question with like, what direction should we go in next? You really could, if you were really on a board, you could be like, well, over the next 10 years, we need to be working on our X. In programming, we need to be able to do this. And this gives you flexibility. People might say programming or strategic direction or something like that, but there's opportunities for them to kind of weigh those and talk about it. You could answer this question. You'd have to be invested in it, but you could answer it. What about this? Or this? So this isn't even just asking what you like, because you could like anything. You could say, you know, I don't know, I liked it when Mary Frances almost drew on the whiteboard. You could say, I really liked the coffee. But what you're asking here is you're saying, what was really most valuable? What did you take? The difference between what's valuable and what you liked is also really important. What did you take from today that was valuable to you? This helps me. This is exploratory and impressionistic, right? I'm starting to look and see, well, what is it that people really valued about it? Let me do more of that if I can, or at least make sure I don't leave it out. And then what was missing from today's presentation? What was not covered? What did you want to have happen that wasn't here? Which is much different than what did you dislike. It's a completely different question. You might care more about what you disliked, but I don't know about you guys, like, usually if I dislike something about a lecture, it's like either it was leveled wrong, you know, like I just didn't get anything out of it, in which case I'm not gonna have a lot of value, or the presenter was just really terrible, or the room was really hot. Like I mean, I guess if the presenter's terrible, that's important, but it's not really about the content. I wanna know what was missing. And what about this? Would you run away from that as much as you ran away from the other one? Why not?
Because I have an option to fill it out if I feel like I have something I can contribute.
So one, you feel more invited, don't you? Like, it's just more inclusive. It's less attacking, and it also gives people an opportunity just to say anything about the whole survey that they didn't like. I will often put this, like in that school survey, I'm pretty sure that I put in there, in just one of their open-ended things, I can't endorse this because I don't know what it means, right? Because I needed this question, right? I needed to be able to say this doesn't make sense to me. They also sent out another survey. I don't mean to be picking on them. They actually are incredibly smart, capable, wonderful people there. But they sent out another survey that was like, you're getting a survey because you have a kid who's involved in the music program, and they said, you know, answer these questions, but they didn't give me instructions about which kid to focus on. I only had one, but if I had like 3, I would have been really confused. And the questions, I knew what they were trying to get at. They were trying to figure out whether or not how important their program was to my kid's musical development, but they didn't ask that. They asked how much private lessons they had and when they started and all this other stuff that got around, like in the aggregate would get to the question, but didn't actually ask me the darn question, aside from the fact that I could have been averaging 3 kids. And so I actually wrote in one of the open-ended things, you know, it was really hard to answer this because, you know, if I had more than one kid, and what I think you want to know is how important the music program is to my kid, and it is incredibly important. But I'm not sure you got that from the questions that you asked me. Just because qualitative research, which is what this is the quality, getting a quality of data as opposed to a quantity of data, is really difficult. I do have a couple of different readings you can do. The problem with these is they're kind of academic. On this one, you should start on page 14. None of the rest of it matters. And maybe one of the things I'll do as I go forward is write a little, you know, brief on qualitative data or something for the community. I haven't really been able to find anything really useful, but these have some methodologies and some tips and tricks and stuff for how to do that. All right. So you've asked your brilliant question. What do you do now? One thing that I always do is I take all of the questions and I just put them on a sheet of paper and I hand them out, right? Because different people have different impressions of reading those answers, and it's usually very informative to the people who are getting the information, right? So like if you have a data team or a board or just your leadership team or whatever, and you want to see what the open-ended questions say, you really just should present them all. You should have the question, you should present all the answers, because it gives people a feeling, you know, like reading a story. But you can't just, and you could use those quotes if you wanted to in marketing or bubbles in your, you know, little word bubbles or something in your application to an RFP or anything like that. But you also want to be able to see how people's answers change over time. You want some ability to quantify what you have. Okay, so we're gonna go from words to graph. Ready? It's gonna be fun. Oh. You need to be it is up to you to not take your data out, to not arbitrarily decide that some data is not valuable because they're thinking differently than other people. In research, outliers are, what happens with outliers is we always average it mathematically, and the outlier changes the average unduly, right? So if everybody's focused between 10 and 4, and you have somebody who rated a 50, and you take an average, you're gonna end up, like at 22 or something, which doesn't represent anybody. So in research, you take out outliers. However, there's also, in my opinion, and in a lot of other researchers' opinions, those outliers are really important. Those are really interesting. That's where the interesting data is, actually, unless you're trying to look at central tendency of what most people think. So especially when you're doing your qualitative data analysis and looking at your short answers, I would make sure that you really be careful about taking out people's data. Because that one person who is brave enough, or weird enough, or different enough to put in that answer, that might be important to you guys. It might just be that they're the only person who is willing to say it, right? It might be that they represent a whole lot of people who really didn't want to say anything bad, but they just said it, right? They also might just be a nut. But I would be thoughtful about taking out that information. You definitely don't want to do it systematically. Oh, can I also say, when you do short answer questions, most people are not going to answer them, period. And people are definitely, on average, unless you're talking to your board and you're asking them about your strategic direction, they are definitely not going to answer it if they have to write full sentences. They need to be able to express what's important to them briefly and quickly. You can give them space to say more, but people don't like them. You should also never lead with them. Nobody's going to finish a survey that starts with short answer questions. So be prepared for them to be optional. Make sure that you're asking short, succinct, clear, concrete questions. Make sure that the questions are meaningful, and have them at the end. Okay. You can do it. So the first thing you need to do is read through all your responses. I usually type them into Excel and put them in column A. So each response has its own row, and the first column is the answers. I type them in there, I read through them. I just read through them openly, not expecting anything. Then I start to identify the themes in my head. So by the time I finish reading, I'm like, okay, well, some people answered here, some people answered there, some people answered there. And then you give each of those themes a number, and you, in column B, you put the number of that theme. I usually off to the side write what the theme means, like 1 equals this, 2 equals that. Then you can graph how many of each of the numbers you have, and then you can pull out illustrative examples that help the reader know what you meant by this. So oh, here's another way of thinking about how things cluster. People can, answers can fall into more than one category. So you could have an answer that spoke to both themes, 2 themes or 3 themes. So how do you know what themes you're looking for? This is a very, very good question, and it has to come from you. Sometimes in a priori analysis, which means that we have the themes in our heads in advance, we know what we're looking for. We have an idea that we are looking for X, Y, and Z, and we want to categorize it that way. Other times, we want to see what people said. It's more exploratory. We're not sure what our categories will be. And most of the time, we're doing both. Most of the time, we have a general idea of what it is we're going to ask people, what kinds of answers they may have, but we're open to emerging themes. If you're really doing the whole thing, like, what would you like CNE to see next, to do next? Well, that's completely wide open. There's no a priori ideas about that, I guess, unless it has to fit within the context of what CNE does. Although I'm sure even if you asked for something that CNE didn't do, like how to dress for work or something, they would just bring in a different expert or send it off to another partner. So usually you're doing a little bit of both. And you have to decide what kind of categories are important to you. I tend to decide kind of as I'm reading them. But then you want them not too big, you want them not too small. I mean, if you have them be too small, then basically you might have 15 answers in 10 categories. That's not helpful, right? If you have 15 answers, I would say you want like 3 or 4 categories, because then you're starting to be able to kind of understand what's in there. You need to make it manageable, but not so manageable that it's not helpful. If you have 15 answers in 2 categories, more than likely you're not, I mean, you could have important information there, but you're probably missing a lot of nuance. So sometimes then what you might want to have is more than one, let answers have more than one category. So you could look at the overall category and then you could look at the subcategories. Okay. So I did this as a 9-hour workshop, and what we did is I had people fill out the survey and we asked, what information did you find most helpful, and these were the answers from the class. Thinking through immediate and long-term outcomes, wording of questions, how to word and the spacing on answers, the logic model, the discussion. The speaker was great, although sometimes too fast, well-organized slides, the content flow, graphing, impact mapping. The speaker kept the information at a level I could understand, let me know I didn't need statistics, creativity she uses in personalizing the methods, simple data collection tools. So these are the answers of the people in the class. So this is nice, right? I mean, you can read this, you have a pretty general idea, but how do you show it? Here's one way of categorizing it. So what I did is I said, oh, this should just say helpful. I'm taking out a feeling on the other one, sorry about that. So here you have all the items in Excel. This is column A. Here's column B, here's column C. And the categories that I felt were in here that were useful and helpful to me was saying who appreciated the impact map, who found the impact map the most helpful, who found the survey design to be the most helpful, who thought the presentation style was sort of the most helpful, who thought using analysis was the most helpful, and who had some other kind of thing that they thought was helpful. You might come up with different categories. Does anyone have a different set? I mean, it's a little hard now that I've shown you categories to undo them, but did anyone have sort of a different idea of what categories should be? I could have put discussion with presentation, because presentation begets discussion. That'd be fine, if that felt helpful to me.
What's the difference in code 1 and code 2?
It just allows them to have more than one code. Right, so here they say, the speaker kept the information at a level I could understand, which is the presentation, and let me know I didn't need statistics, which was analysis. Right, so I've only got however many, 10 responses, but I've got 11 codes that describe the content of those responses. What I don't have is I don't have like negative codes, right? Really, I'm just saying, what did you find most helpful? And so this negative comment really kind of gets left out. It doesn't get left out in my heart. I go, okay, I know that. But since this is the only, I mean, we didn't ask here for negative things, but since this is the only negative thing, I just told that, but I also know that what they thought was most helpful was the style. So I feel good about continuing to put it in a presentation. Now I'm numbering the codes. So everything that's an impact map gets code 1. Everything that's design, survey design, gets code 2. Everything that is other gets a 5, presentation gets a 3, analysis gets a 4. I had 3 1s, 3 2s, 4 3s, 3 4s, and 2 5s. Well, now I graphed it. This gives you a very quick, good idea of what people found most helpful. I look at this and I'm like, okay, well, one, it's limitedly helpful because there's so few people and I have 3 threes. But I know that the content is really important, but that people really are, so a lot of people felt like regardless of the content, without me being a good presenter, that was what made the difference to them. So you go from, how cool is this? A bunch of words, which gives you a good idea of what's going on, to a graph that helps you look at things over time, that you can put into a grant, that you could present to your board, that totally is able to use your answers.
Well, this is, I'm just thinking about the survey we do for our centers, is we do at the end ask, what activities would you like to see? And it is kind of difficult because we get so many replies back to find a way to really make something very easy to review quickly. And it could be categorized into like, art or, some of the community, something that really is,
Well, and
able
if
to
this
be
was,
demonstrated.
if this was social interactions,
Like physical
meals,
activity,
art,
Yeah.
these kinds of things, then what you could do is you could give these big categories,
Mhm.
and then you go, okay, well, let's go see what people wanted in art.
Yeah.
And then you go back to the words and you look at everything here that is coded art, and then you can focus your attention very quickly on the breadth of things that people asked for. And you might not be helping, you might not everybody might have wanted art, but if you're like, well, we've got,
A lot more.
we've got $300 to spend on activities, how are we gonna do it? You're gonna do it on art, and then you're gonna go look at the art and figure out what kinds of things they want art. You could do the same analysis with it too. Although if you only have 20 responses, you might be able to just do it with your eyes. But if you had 300 responses.
Well, that's the thing, all of our, we have 7 sites, and we're all giving us, we want to see this and this and this, and it's always been, we collect it, but it's been a little tricky to really make sure you're capturing everybody's feedback.
This also keeps you from, it gives equal weight to each response, which is kind of nice, because a lot of times you might find yourself really excited about a particular response, and that might outweigh all the other ones.
Somebody wants to play something other than bingo?
I know. We're gonna do that. When in fact, everybody really said bingo.
Right.
Okay. So this is all I have to show you on this, because that's really all there is. But I also appreciate that this is kind of a new concept. It's kind of cool, it's kind of different. So before we leave here, I want to pause for a minute and just give you guys an opportunity to sort of ask questions or think more about how you might use it. It's harder to do on focus groups and interviews, but you can still do it. So I did a comprehensive assessment of gang activity for the Charlottesville Police and Albemarle Police. And we did interviews. We interviewed, I forget now, like 20 gang members or something. And they gave us, we did these hour-long interviews, and we asked questions, and we went into each we had them transcribed, which cost a huge amount of money. And we then took the transcription and we started to look for themes inside each question. So we read through all of them, then we went back and we went question to question. We started with the first one, created some themes, used those in our head, went to the next one, looked to see if there were themes. And we didn't number them, but we wanted to be able to talk about what it, actually we did. We said, and we didn't make graphs, but we said like 8 out of the 10 people talked about this as being important, or the majority of people talked about this as being important, or this being the reason they joined the gang, or something like that. So we took, and we lost so much in the summary, but what we also then did is we took out quotes for each section. So we said, 90% of the people asking why they got to a gang said because they didn't see any other opportunities for making money, right? And so then we have this little quote underneath it that says, man, I looked around and there weren't any opportunities and I couldn't make money and I already had a record, no one was gonna hire me, so what else was I gonna do, okay? Or we ask, what would you be doing if you weren't in the gang? And, people say this, that, and the other, and we have one guy that says, man, I'm 30 years old and I don't have any savings and I don't have any retirement and I've got a kid and I want my life better, right? We don't think about people in gangs like that very often, but we're like, okay, so how can we help these folks? So you can use it in interviews, you can use it in focus groups. We also used it a whole bunch of years ago now, we did a human services strategic plan, and we went around the country, went around the city of Charlottesville and Albemarle County, went to a lot of senior center locations too, and we did focus groups. So we asked people what was working, what wasn't working, what they need in the community. We fed them, we took all their focus group information, we transcribed it, and we counted and coded it, and we did do graphs, because we needed to be able to talk about that. That's a little tricky because focus groups don't have the same number of people in it. So if you're looking at the data from a focus group that has 2 people in it, and you're looking at data from a focus group that has 10, and then you're rating those the same, that's a little bit tricky. You have to be thoughtful about that. But you can still do it. You can figure it out. Especially if what the 2 people say is the same as the 10 people, then you don't really even worry about it.
So, for us, we have a lot of one-off workshops, and I think we can, across the year, we can categorize, we have 3 types of programs. And the participation, the audience level would grow and contract based on the type of program. I can see like after a year, after a certain amount, like 6 months, creating the categories of, the content types. But I can't see us being able to forecast what those would be.
That's
like,
totally
starting
fine.
off,
So maybe what you do is maybe you just collect them and put them in Excel for a while. And then at the end of a period of time, you go and look and see what categories are emerging, what's important to people. It's also good, and then that might inform what questions you put into your survey, right? After that, you might add another question, because you might start finding that everybody says X, Y, and Z is important, or a lot of people say it's important, and that's really important to you, and it's important to communicate to your funders. And so now you're gonna scale that question. So when you have your this, what you would probably want is another column right here that was like date, right? Or program, or whatever it was that helped you know where it came from. And that way, once you coded it, you could sort it by that date or program type, and you could see if people cared in different kinds of ways and graph it in different kinds of ways and stuff like that. But probably, you would just pull it all together at the end.
I guess it could be really helpful too if you had sessions, like you offered the same workshop 5 times, but the sessions had to be small, like only 5 people could participate in each session. You could aggregate them.
You aggregate them, yes. Just like you would aggregate the numbers, you would just aggregate the open-ended responses. You can also do this, right now I'm working with Mental Health America. If anyone in here got an email from them to participate in a listening session, please do. I'm working with Mental Health America because they're trying to figure out like what strategic direction to go in next. So we're doing listening sessions and individual interviews with people to ask, to find out what do they think. And we're not going to transcribe those because it's just, the cost isn't worth the benefit, right? It's expensive enough to get people into a room and to give them snacks and to have them facilitated and all that kind of stuff. So we're just going to take very good notes. We recorded it, we're going to take notes, we're going to go back, we're going to make sure that all the perspectives are in each of the questions, and then we're going to delete the tapes. And we're not going to really count things, we're going to give them sort of a more descriptive, we'll count like most of the focus groups, or 5 out of the 6 focus groups, or something like that, this was mentioned. But we're going to just sort of help them get a sense of where people in the community think they should go. So you can do it as tight or as big as you want. In grad school, we created a coding system. We had parents and kids come in and talk to each other, either having the parents provide the kids support with something or arguing through a conflict. And then we went and we coded them. And we coded them like micro. Like how many times did the parent do this? And how many times did the kid do that? And what did they say here? And what was here? So you can get tight, super, super tight, or you can be really loose, like what we're doing with Mental Health America. And it just depends on your need. You guys are never going to need to be super, super tight unless you are working with a real evaluator or a real researcher. Questions?
So this is, again, probably very specific to us, but with limited capacity, the 2 of us and our board, what's the decision-making in terms of what the priorities are and what you want to be measuring? Because across the year, we have so many different things happening.
Your impact map. You have to start by knowing what you want to measure. So you guys say, if here are all the things we want to measure, And, I mean, you can sort of make it, you could have a little discussion like this among your board, where you say, what's most important? Everybody kind of ranks it, you vote. I have an activity I've done here at CNE and also with the United Way, which I really enjoy doing because it's another way of getting everybody's voice out. So when you're trying to think with your team about what's the priority, first, what fits our goals? Because there's always things people want to measure that don't actually feed back to your goals, right? Because we're curious people. You wouldn't be in here if you weren't curious. So first, you might say, I'm sorry, that's outside the goals, right? Or outside what we might reasonably expect our activities to result in. So that's the first sifting. But then you want everybody to really be able to communicate what they think is important. So what I do is I get a whiteboard or this kind of board, and I have people just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk about what's important. What's important, what's important, what's important. We write it all down. I poll for people to say things. You know, I really make sure that we're inclusive, getting everybody's voice out there. I don't care what it says. I don't worry about it overlapping. Nothing. I just put it up there. I don't care what the categories are. I just put it up there. Then I give everybody like 6 Post-it notes or index cards, and I say, what I want you to do is I want you to write down out of all of these things, don't worry about overlap, don't worry about anything, tell me what your 6 most important things are to you on here. And everybody does that, they don't have too much of a problem with it. And then I say, okay, now what I want you to do is I want you to throw 2 of those away. And everybody's like, ooh. And then I might even have them throw another one away. So what you really have then is this distillation of what they think is really most important. And people will tell you all the time, they're like, oh, I cheated because this one could really go under that one. I don't care. What I want is a dialogue and a discussion where everybody's voice about what's important is out there. Then I have everybody read their cards and we just put check marks against it. And then we can have a discussion about what's most important. Because we're not voting. And things overlap, and people might say, oh yeah, that one got 5 checks, and that one got 4 checks, and those are really the same thing, and I'm like, well, in that case, it got 9 checks, and that's super important. What do you guys think about that? Do you want that included or not included? It just elevates the discussion to really focusing on what's important, as opposed to getting rid of all the other stuff. And I have watched in this process, which I've done many times now, I have watched people who are like, this is important, this is important, this is important, literally fist banging, dropping it by the time we got to the top. Because they also realized through that process that what they thought was really important really wasn't important to the group, and that was okay, right? They were heard. So that's a way of kind of using generally this kind of technique to sort of start a conversation, but then you have that conversation and you're starting to figure out what's most important, but you're always tying it back to your impact map. That's the organizational frame that keeps the conversation in the room. Other questions? Response rates.